The gun was pressed against Paul Covington's temple before Harriet Thatcher even realized she had pulled it from her skirt pocket. Her hand was not shaking. That was the part that frightened her most. The hand of a woman who had once fainted at the sight of a slaughtered hog was now perfectly, terrifyingly steady, the barrel of her late husband's Colt pressed flush against the skull of the one man she had ever truly loved. "Tell me the truth," she said. Her voice was quiet. That was worse than shouting. Even Paul seemed to understand that. She could see the muscles in his jaw tighten, the way his dark eyes cut sideways before returning to her face with something that looked unbearably like grief. "Tell me why you were in that office. Tell me what you signed. And do not lie to me, Paul Covington, because I have swallowed enough lies in this lifetime to fill the Rio Grande, and I will not swallow another one." The saloon was dead silent. 30 men who had been drinking, gambling, and arguing about cattle prices 10 seconds ago were now motionless, glasses suspended halfway to lips, cards held mid-deal. The lantern light swayed overhead, sending shadows lurching across the sawdust floor like nervous ghosts. Paul raised both hands slowly, palms out, the gesture of a man who had grown up knowing the language of surrender. His hat had been knocked sideways in the scuffle that had preceded this moment, and a dark bruise was already blooming along his left cheekbone. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous country is beautiful, the kind of beauty that cuts you open if you touch it carelessly. "Harriet," he said, low, careful, "the way you speak to something wild that you do not want to startle. That is not an answer. You would not have pulled that trigger in the time it took me to say your name," he said, "which means some part of you still trusts me." "Some part of me trusted my father," she said, "and he sold my mother's land to a railroad company the morning after she was buried. Trust is not the same as love, and love is not the same as safety. Now talk." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, she saw something collapse behind them, some carefully constructed wall, and what came flooding out was not the betrayal she expected. It was something closer to devastation. "I signed the papers," he said, "because if I did not, they were going to hang you for a murder you did not commit." The gun did not waver, but something inside Harriet's chest cracked open like dry earth after the first hard rain. 6 weeks earlier, Harriet Thatcher had arrived in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, on the afternoon train from Wichita with 2 trunks, a sewing box, a botanical field guide her mother had given her before the fever took her, and approximately $47 to her name. It was the summer of 1878, and Caldwell sat right at the edge of what most civilized people still called the frontier, a cattle town that smelled of dust and ambition, and the particular kind of desperation that gathers in places where fortunes can be made or lost between one sunrise and the next. The Kishome Trail ran through it like a vein. Longhorns moved through in great rivers of hide and horn. Cowboys who had been in the saddle for months descended on the saloons and bathhouses with a violence of need that was almost poetic in its urgency. Harriet had come because of an advertisement. She was not ashamed of that, or not very. The advertisement had appeared in the Wichita Eagle and had asked for a schoolteacher with experience in primary instruction, good moral character, and a willingness to reside in a frontier community. It had mentioned decent accommodation and a salary of $22 per month, which was not a fortune but was, to Harriet, the difference between independence and a slow suffocation. She was 26 years old. She had been a widow for 8 months, her husband Thomas having died of a burst appendix the previous October after 3 years of a marriage that had been neither cruel nor particularly warm, simply a practical arrangement between 2 people who lacked the courage to want more. She had grieved him honestly and briefly, and then had gotten up and started solving the problem of her own life, which was something she had always been better at than feeling things in an unguarded way. The problem was that Thomas had debts she had not known about. Nothing scandalous, just the ordinary kind of small recklessness that comes from a man who cannot say no to a good opportunity, which meant the house in Wichita had gone to the bank and the furniture after it, and suddenly Harriet owned very little except the contents of 2 trunks and a field guide, and the particular hard-edged competence that comes from being a woman who has had to figure everything out for herself. Caldwell's schoolhouse needed her. That was enough. She stepped off the train into a wall of late July heat and stood for a moment on the platform, organizing herself the way she always did, spine straight, chin up, inventory taken. The town was noisy and sun-bleached and slightly chaotic, the main street wide enough to turn a cattle drive in and lined with buildings that ranged from the solidly permanent to the optimistically temporary. There was a general store, a land office, 2 saloons, a hotel, a barbershop, a bank, and a building being actively constructed by 3 men who were arguing about something involving a beam. A wagon was supposed to meet her. The town council had promised a wagon. No wagon materialized. Harriet waited 20 minutes. Then she picked up the smaller of her trunks, left the larger one at the station under the care of a boy. She paid 15 cents to watch it, and walked toward the nearest establishment that looked like it might contain a person with useful information. This turned out to be the smaller of the 2 saloons, a place called the Prairie Rose, which at 3 in the afternoon was relatively civilized. She pushed open the door and walked in. The man behind the bar was broad-shouldered and had the look of someone who had once done something more interesting with his life and was now deciding whether to regret it. To her left, a woman in a yellow dress was teaching a young Mexican boy how to count cards, which Harriet found more educational than anything she had planned for the schoolhouse curriculum. And at a table in the corner, half hidden behind a newspaper and a cup of coffee, was a man who looked up when she came in and then immediately looked back down, which was both rude and intriguing. "Excuse me," she said to the bartender. "I am looking for someone named Alderman Croft. He represents the town council and was supposed to arrange transport from the station for the new schoolteacher." The bartender's expression did a complicated thing. "That would be you, then." "It would." "Alderman Croft," the bartender said with the tone of a man choosing his words carefully around something rot, "is currently indisposed." Meaning he took a fever 3 days ago and has not been out of his bed since. Harriet absorbed this. "Is there another member of the town council who might help me?" "Marcus Webb runs the council these days," the bartender said. "His office is at the land company building, 2nd block north side." "Thank you." She turned to go and then heard from the corner a quiet voice. "He will not help you either." She turned back. The man with the newspaper had lowered it. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 more, with the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor life into something angular and particular. Dark hair, dark eyes, the shadow of several days of stubble. He wore a gray shirt and a brown vest and a hat that had seen considerably more weather than he appeared to have. He was looking at her with an expression that she could not immediately categorize, which was unusual. Harriet was generally good at categorizing expressions. "I beg your pardon," she said. "Marcus Webb," the man said. "If you are the new schoolteacher, he will not help you. He has been arguing against bringing you here for 2 months. He thinks the money the town council agreed to pay for schooling is better spent on road improvements. And you know this how? Because I work for Marcus Webb," the man said. "Or I did until this morning." There was a silence. "That is an interesting piece of information," Harriet said, "though it raises more questions than it answers." "Most true things do," the man said, and went back to his newspaper. Harriet stood there for a moment, assessing. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He lowered the newspaper again and looked at her with what might have been surprise and what might have been something else entirely. "I have a large trunk at the train station," she said. "No accommodation, no transport, and apparently a hostile town council. You have just quit a job with the most powerful man in town. That suggests you either have a conscience or a death wish, and either way you are probably not doing anything useful this afternoon. My name is Harriet Thatcher. Will you help me?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Paul Covington," he said. He did not offer his hand, which she found she respected, since it meant he was taking her seriously as a person rather than performing politeness. "And yes, I will help you." The story of how Paul Covington had come to quit his job with Marcus Webb that morning was not one he told all at once. It came out in pieces over the following days and weeks, the way a person's real history always does when you are paying attention, not in a dramatic confession, but in small disclosures that accumulate into something comprehensible. He had come to Caldwell 2 years earlier from a ranch in Texas where he had worked as a foreman. The ranch had been owned by a man named Gideon Covington, who was Paul's uncle, and Paul had been good at the work, genuinely good, with a natural authority over men and animals that came from patience rather than intimidation. But Gideon Covington had died and left the ranch to his son, who was young and arrogant and had no interest in his cousin's opinions, and so Paul had left. He had taken a position as a land agent with Marcus Webb's company because Webb had offered him decent pay and the kind of work that seemed to require intelligence. For 2 years he had surveyed parcels, negotiated with farmers and recorded transactions, and it had been fine, or fine enough. Then, 6 weeks before Harriet's arrival, Marcus Webb had asked him to do something that was not fine at all. He had asked Paul to falsify a deed. The land in question belonged to a family named the de Lackerts, French-Canadian settlers who had been on their parcel for 11 years, and who had, in that time, turned rocky Kansas scrubland into something that actually produced wheat. The de Lackerts had a deed and a clear title, but Webb had a buyer, a railroad speculator from St. Louis named Harlan Fitch, and the price that Fitch was willing to pay was considerably more than the de Lackerts would ever see unless they sold voluntarily, which they had declined, politely, but firmly, to do. Webb's solution was elegant in the way that truly corrupt solutions often are. He wanted Paul to alter the survey record so that the de Lackert property line fell within the boundary of a disputed federal land grant, which would make their deed legally questionable and give Webb's company grounds to challenge their title. It would take years to resolve in the courts. The de Lackerts, who had 3 children and needed their harvest income, would not survive years. Paul had sat across the desk from Marcus Webb on the morning of Harriet's arrival, listened to the full proposal, and then said no. Webb had smiled. Men like Webb always smiled when they were refused. It was a smile that said the refusal was temporary, a minor obstacle, merely the first move in a longer game. "Think it over," Webb had said. "I have thought it over," Paul said. "My answer is no." He had collected his belongings, which did not take long, and gone to the Prairie Rose for coffee, which was where Harriet found him. He did not tell her any of this that first afternoon. He told her instead about the town, about which members of the council could be trusted and which could not, about the location of the boarding house where Mrs. Clara Adkins rented rooms to respectable women, and where Harriet would be comfortable. He retrieved her trunk from the station himself, loading it into a borrowed wagon with the efficiency of someone who has spent a lifetime making practical things happen in impractical circumstances. He showed her the schoolhouse, a single-room building on the eastern edge of town that smelled of chalk and mouse activity and needed considerable cleaning, but had good light from the south-facing windows and a reliable iron stove. "It has potential," Harriet said. "Most things do," Paul said, and then seemed surprised that he had said it. She moved into Mrs. Adkins's boarding house and spent the first week cleaning the schoolhouse, ordering supplies, posting notices around town about the school's opening, and making the kind of careful observations about her new community that she considered essential before forming any strong opinions. Caldwell in the summer of 1878 was a town in the process of deciding what kind of place it wanted to be, and that process was not gentle. The cattle trade brought money and violence in roughly equal measure. The cowboys who trailed the Longhorns north were mostly young men from Texas, and they were not, as a general rule, given to careful behavior. There were fights most nights and a shooting at least once a week, though Deputy Tom Hartley, who was something of a reluctant lawman, generally kept things from escalating to genuine catastrophe. The town had a sheriff, too, A man named Amos Birch who was old enough to remember bleeding Kansas and whose authority was based almost entirely on the force of his reputation and the fact that no one had yet tested it successfully. Webb's Land Company occupied the most substantial building on the main street, its sign freshly painted, its windows large. Webb himself was a compact, well-dressed man of about 45 who appeared, on the surface, to be exactly the kind of civic-minded entrepreneur that frontier towns desperately needed. He funded the church's roof repair. He donated to the school fund in public, though Harriet would later learn that the donation had never actually arrived. He was respected by people who did not look too closely at the machinery behind his respectability. Paul, who had spent 2 years looking closely, had a very different view. He and Harriet did not immediately become friends. That was not how either of them operated. They were both people who had been disappointed enough times to approach closeness the way you approach a fire in a dry season, carefully and from upwind. But Caldwell was not a large town, and their lives kept intersecting. He fixed the schoolhouse window latch, which had been broken since the previous teacher left. She brought him a book from her trunk, a collection of survey methods published in Philadelphia, because she had heard Mrs. Adkins mention that he was teaching himself drafting. He read the book and returned it with 2 pages of notes in the margins, precise and thoughtful, and she found herself reading his notes more than once. He told her about the Delackerts. He had not intended to, but they ran into each other near the feed store one morning in August, and she noticed that he was buying a considerable amount of seed grain, more than one man could use, and she asked why. He told her. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. The Delackerts had lost their hired hand to a broken leg and were behind on their planting, and Paul had been quietly helping them. He had also, quietly and without fanfare, begun talking to a lawyer in Wichita about the disputed land grant, trying to understand whether Webb's plan had any legal merit at all. "It does not," he told her, leaning against the feed store wall, squinting into the August sun. "The land grant boundary does not come within 3 miles of the Delackert property, but Webb has people at the county records office in Wichita, and I believe he has already begun filing things that will need to be challenged." "What kind of people?" Harriet asked. "The kind who are paid to see things a certain way." She was quiet for a moment. "What will you do?" "Whatever I can," he said, which was not nothing. She understood that. She began helping him with the paperwork, in the evenings after school, sitting at the table in Mrs. Adkins's parlor while Paul spread out survey maps and legal documents, and she cross-referenced dates and boundaries with the methodical precision of a woman who had once organized her husband's entire law practice before Thomas decided he preferred to keep things chaotic. She had a mind for patterns, for finding the one thing that was slightly wrong in a long column of numbers, and she used it now with the focus of someone who has finally found work that matters. It was September when he told her about the falsified deed request. They were sitting on the front steps of the schoolhouse after a long evening of document work, the air finally cool enough to breathe properly, the stars over Kansas outrageous in their abundance. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You are a genuinely decent man," she said. "That is rarer than it ought to be." He turned and looked at her, and she looked back, and it was one of those moments that both of them would remember afterward because something shifted in it, something irretrievable and wonderful and frightening. "You said it like it surprised you," he said. "It does not surprise me," she said. "I have been watching you for 6 weeks. But it is still rare enough to be worth saying." He did not say anything to that, but he stayed sitting beside her on the steps longer than he needed to, and when he finally stood to go, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was small and formal and somehow the most tender thing she had seen in years. She thought about that gesture for 3 days. The school opened on the 1st of September with 11 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, including 2 of the Delackert children, a daughter of the blacksmith, several children of ranching families, and 3 Cowboys' children whose fathers were apparently planning to winter in Caldwell rather than return to Texas. They were a mixed and lively group, and Harriet threw herself into teaching them with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from doing something you actually love. She was a good teacher. She had been teaching since she was 19, first in Wichita's church school, and then in the small private school where she had met Thomas, who had been on the school board. She knew how to hold attention, how to find the particular thing that made a child suddenly understand why learning mattered, how to manage a room of restless young people without either becoming a tyrant or losing all authority. The parents of her students, cautiously at first and then with increasing warmth, began to trust her. Mothers stopped her after church to ask about their children's progress. The blacksmith, a large and gentle man named August Honer, fixed the schoolhouse chimney without being asked. Mrs. Adkins began saving Harriet the best place at the dinner table, which in its way was a more significant honor than anything official. Paul came to the school one afternoon in late September with a donation of paper and pencils he had purchased in Wichita on a trip to consult with the lawyer there. He brought them quietly without announcement, setting the box on her desk while the children were at their midday break. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him across the desk. The afternoon light was coming through the southern windows the way it always did in September, golden and precise, making everything look more significant than it perhaps was. "How did the meeting in Wichita go?" she asked. His expression told her before his words did. "Not well. The lawyer thinks Webb has managed to get a judge in his pocket. We can still challenge the deed filing, but it will be expensive and slow, and the Delackerts do not have the money to sustain a prolonged legal fight." "I have $47, Harriet said immediately. Paul looked at her. "Harriet, I have $47, she repeated. "It is not much, but it is mine to give where I choose, and I choose the Delackerts." He was quiet for a long moment. "That is very generous." "It is practical," she said. "If Webb is allowed to take their land this way, he will do it to someone else next month and someone else the month after. This town will belong to him entirely within 5 years unless someone stops him. I would rather spend $47 on stopping him now than spend considerably more later." "That is an extremely logical way to justify generosity," Paul said. "I am an extremely logical person," she said. He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile fully, without qualification, and it reorganized his whole face into something that made her breath catch in an embarrassing and involuntary way. "You are," he said. "You are also the most capable person in Caldwell, and that is including everyone who has been here longer than 2 months." She felt warmth move through her that she was not entirely sure how to manage. "You are being generous," she said. "I am being accurate," he said. And then, because he was Paul Covington and not given to romantic speeches, he picked up his hat from where he had set it on the edge of her desk and left. Harriet sat alone in the schoolhouse for several minutes after he was gone, listening to the sound of children playing outside, and thought carefully about several things that she did not entirely know how to think about yet. October came, and with it the first hard frost, and the cattle drives wound down as the season turned. Caldwell grew quieter, the transient population of cowboys thinning as men returned south or found winter work, and the town settled into the more permanent version of itself, the one made of families and businesses and long-term plans. Paul had found work with the Delackerts, earning his keep by helping with the autumn harvest, and using his drafting skills to produce accurate survey maps of their property that would be useful in the legal challenge. He had also, with characteristic quiet efficiency, managed to find 2 other families who had been similarly pressured by Webb's company and whose stories, combined with the Delackerts, created something more substantial for the Wichita lawyer to work with. He came to the boarding house for supper most Saturdays, which Mrs. Adkins had arranged with a transparent and entirely unapologetic attempt at matchmaking. Paul sat across from Harriet at the long table and they talked about everything: the school, the legal case, the town's politics, books they had each read, the nature of the country itself, the way Kansas looked in autumn, tawny and enormous and slightly melancholy, as if the landscape itself was thinking about something important. He was, she discovered, a man who had read widely and thought carefully and who had, somewhere along the way, decided that most public performance of himself was not worth the energy. He said less than other men but meant more by it. He listened in a way that most people do not, fully, and without preparing his response before you finish speaking. She began to understand that she was falling in love with him in the methodical, comprehensive way that she did most important things, piece by piece, and with full knowledge of what she was doing. It was terrifying and entirely wonderful. She did not say anything. She was a logical woman who understood that timing and circumstance matter, and the circumstance they were in involved an ongoing legal fight, a hostile, powerful man, and the very real possibility that things were about to become considerably more complicated. She was right about that. On a Thursday evening in late October, Harriet was walking back from the schoolhouse to the boarding house at dusk, carrying a stack of graded papers, when she saw two men come out of Webb's land office and stand talking on the step. She did not think much of it until she was close enough to recognize one of them. The other man was not Marcus Webb. He was taller than Webb, heavier, with expensive clothes and the air of someone who is accustomed to being the most important person in any room he enters. She had never seen him before. He was smoking a cigar and gesturing in the direction of the eastern edge of town, where the Delacourt farm lay beyond the town limits. The man glanced at her as she passed. His gaze was the kind that assesses and files rather than sees. She asked Mrs. Adkins about him that evening over supper. Mrs. Adkins knew everyone in Caldwell and most of the people who passed through. She went still when Harriet described the man. Heavy, expensive coat, gray at the temples. Yes, that is Harlan Fitch, Mrs. Adkins said quietly. He has come from St. Louis. The last time he came through here was 2 years ago, when he acquired the Benson property. She paused. The Bensons had to move to Colorado. The air in the room changed in the way it does when something that has been abstract becomes suddenly and urgently real. Harriet sent a message to Paul that evening through the Delacourt boy who sometimes helped at the boarding house. She did not know exactly what she wanted to warn him about. She knew only that Fitch's arrival meant that whatever Webb was planning was moving faster than they had thought. Paul arrived at the boarding house the next morning before breakfast. He sat across from her in Mrs. Adkins's parlor with his hat in his hands, and she told him what she had seen, and he was quiet for a long time. Fitch being here means Webb thinks he is close to having what he needs, Paul said. The legal challenge in Wichita may not move fast enough. What else can we do? He looked at her with that particular expression she was coming to know, the one that meant he was thinking several steps ahead and was not entirely comfortable with where the thinking was leading. There is a territorial judge, he said, named Arthur Bain, who is known to be genuinely independent. He rides a circuit that brings him through Caldwell in November. If we can get our documentation in front of him before Webb finalizes whatever he is filing in Wichita, there is a chance he will issue an injunction. How much of a chance? Enough of one, Paul said, but we would need more than we have. More witnesses, more documentation. Specifically, I believe Webb has a second set of books for his land company, genuine records that contradict the false documents he files publicly. If I could get access to those records. You cannot break into his office, Harriet said. No, Paul agreed. He looked at his hat. But I may not need to. His clerk, a young man named Billy Rourke, has been increasingly uncomfortable with what he is being asked to do. I think if someone spoke to him carefully, he might be willing to share what he knows. I will speak to him, Harriet said. Paul looked up. Harriet, who is less likely to attract attention, she said reasonably. The man who publicly quit working for Webb or the schoolteacher who has no known involvement in any of this. I will find a reason to speak to Billy Rourke. I am the schoolteacher. His younger sister is one of my students. I have a perfectly natural reason to speak with him about how she is getting on." The logic was solid and they both knew it. Paul conceded, not gracefully exactly, but honestly, which she respected more. She spoke to Billy Rourke the following Monday, after school, catching him as he came out of the land office for his afternoon break. He was 19, with a face full of unresolved anxiety and the posture of someone carrying a weight he had not expected when he signed on. She spoke to him gently and practically, the way she spoke to nervous students, making it clear that she understood his position and was not asking him to put himself in danger, but only to confirm a few things she already suspected. He confirmed considerably more than that. In a halting and relieved rush, over the course of 20 minutes in which Harriet stood very still and listened with great care, he told her that Webb had indeed maintained a second set of records, that the survey documents filed in Wichita bore alterations he himself had been asked to make, that Webb had paid 2 county officials to expedite certain filings, and that Harlan Fitch had been present at a meeting the previous week in which Webb had described his timeline for acquiring the Delacourt property through legal challenge. He said he could provide written documentation. He said he was afraid. Harriet told him that being afraid was reasonable, but that doing the right thing while being afraid was something she had seen children manage, and she believed he could too. He almost laughed. He agreed. She brought all of this to Paul that evening, sitting at the boarding house table with her notes spread between them. He read through her account twice and then sat back and looked at her with an expression that she would think about for a long time afterward. "You are remarkable," he said. It was not a performance. It was an observation stated the way he stated facts. She did not deflect it. "I have been called worse," she said. "What do we do now?" They spent the next 2 evenings preparing the documentation package for Judge Bain. Billy Rourke provided his written statement, nervous but signed and dated, and they combined it with the survey discrepancies Paul had identified, the Wichita lawyer's preliminary findings, and the testimonies of 2 other families. It was not everything they might have wanted, but it was substantial. And then Webb made his move earlier than they expected. On a Wednesday morning in the first week of November, Harriet arrived at the schoolhouse to find a notice nailed to the door from the town council, signed by Marcus Webb as acting council chair in Alderman Croft's ongoing absence, informing her that her contract was under review due to complaints about the moral character of her association with certain individuals in Caldwell. No details, no names. Just the kind of allegation that is specifically designed to be impossible to disprove, because it is impossible to define. She stood reading it for a long moment, her breath making small clouds in the November cold, and felt a very cold and very clear anger settle into her. She went to the council hall and found Webb there, along with 2 other council members. She did not shout. She laid the notice on the table in front of him and said, very precisely, "If you have specific complaints about my conduct as a teacher, I would like to hear them stated specifically. If you do not have specific complaints, I would like this notice withdrawn and a written confirmation that my contract is intact." Webb smiled his smile. "Mrs. Thatcher, this is simply a matter of propriety. A woman in your position, unmarried, meeting regularly with a man of uncertain reputation." "Paul Covington," she said, "is a man of excellent reputation who has lived and worked honestly in this community. If you have complaints about his character, I would be curious to hear those specified as well." "The council is simply, the council," Harriet said, "is attempting to intimidate me into withdrawing from a situation that does not concern you. You are welcome to pursue the legal review of my contract. I am also welcome to pursue other matters that have recently come to my attention. I suspect neither of us wants a prolonged public dispute." She held his gaze until he looked away, which took a while but was worth waiting for. "Good morning, Mr. Webb." She left. She told Paul that evening, leaving out the part where her hands had been shaking the entire time she was in the council hall, which he did not need to know. He was furious on her behalf in a contained, pressurized way that she found surprisingly moving. "He is trying to use you to get to me," he said. I know, he failed. Harriet, if he escalates, then we escalate faster, she said. The judge arrives in 4 days. What we need to do is get this documentation to him before Webb has any idea that is what we are doing. I agree, Paul said. Then, after a pause, I am sorry you have been put in this position. I put myself in it, she said. I walked across the room and sat down at your table. She looked at him steadily. I would do it again. Something moved across his face that she could not quite read. He started to say something and then stopped. She waited. I want to tell you something, he said, but I am not sure this is the right time. When do you think will be the right time? After all of this is resolved, he said. When I can say it without it looking like he stopped again. She understood. He was a man who had enough integrity to be worried that confessing feelings in the middle of a crisis would look like using the crisis for emotional leverage. She found this quality simultaneously frustrating and devastating in its decency. All right, she said. After 2 days before Judge Bain was due to arrive in Caldwell, everything went wrong. Harriet was walking back from the Delacourt farm, where she had delivered some school materials for the children who had missed a week due to illness, when she heard the shot. It came from the direction of the south end of town, a single crack that seemed to bounce off the flat November sky. She broke into a run without thinking, which was not particularly sensible, but was what happened. By the time she reached the main street, there was already a cluster of people around the entrance to the alley beside Webb's land office. She pushed through, and there on the ground, with blood on his coat and his eyes wide with shock rather than pain, was Billy Rourke. He was alive. The shot had taken him in the shoulder, high and to the right, serious but not immediately fatal. Deputy Hartley was already there, crouching beside him, and when Harriet dropped to her knees on Billy's other side, she saw on his face an expression that was almost entirely fear. "The letter," he said to her, barely audible. "I gave it to the wrong person." "What letter?" "I wrote out everything more than I told you. I was going to give it to Paul Covington to take to the judge." He swallowed. "But someone came to my room last night and said they were from Covington, and I gave it to them." Harriet felt the cold move through her that has nothing to do with weather. "Who was it?" "I did not know him," he said. Billy stopped, his face tightening with pain as Hartley pressed cloth to the wound. "It is all right," Harriet said, though she was not at all sure it was. "Rest. We will deal with this." She stood up. She looked around the gathered crowd with the systematic efficiency of someone who is controlling a very large internal emergency. And then she saw, across the street, leaning against the post outside the general store with his arms folded and his face arranged in an expression of regretful concern, Marcus Webb. He caught her looking. He nodded once in a way that made her skin go cold. She walked to the Prairie Rose. It was the only place she could think clearly. Paul found her there 20 minutes later, which meant someone had told him quickly, which meant he had been watching the situation. He came in through the door and scanned the room until he found her and then crossed to her table in 3 strides, pulling out the chair across from her and sitting without preamble. "Billy," she said. "Someone took his letter. I heard." His jaw was tight. "Webb is moving quickly. If he has Billy's written account, he knows what we have. He will try to counter it before Bain arrives." "He has already tried to have Billy shot," Harriet said. "He is not just countering anymore. He is eliminating." They looked at each other across the small table, and the weight of the situation sat between them, fully acknowledged. "We send what we have to Bain tonight," Paul said. "We do not wait for him to arrive in town. I ride out to meet him on the Circuit Road, give him the documentation directly, and request the injunction before Webb knows Bain has it. They will know you are gone. If they figure out where you are going, Webb does not know which road Bain takes," Paul said. "I do, because I have talked to the circuit court clerk about Bain's schedule. It is not public information." She nodded. It was the right plan. She hated it because it put him in the road alone at night with enemies who had just demonstrated they were willing to shoot people, but she hated the alternatives more. "I am riding with you," she said. "Harriet, I am riding with you," she repeated. "You have the documents. I have the teacher's satchel that no one has searched. If we separate them between us, Even if something happens to one of us, the other still reaches Bain. She held up a hand before he could object. This is a logical argument, and you know it. He knew it. He hated it in the same way she hated his plan for the same reasons, and that symmetry of worry, the particular shape of two people being afraid on each other's behalf, was something that landed in her chest with the weight of something permanent. They rode out 2 hours after dark. Harriet had borrowed a horse from August Honer, who asked no questions but looked at them both with the expression of a man who understood more than was being said and approved of it. The night was clear and very cold, the Kansas stars doing their extravagant thing overhead, and they rode in close company on the circuit road heading northeast. They talked as they rode, quietly, the horse's breath making clouds in the cold air. She asked him about Texas, and he told her about the ranch, the enormous quiet of the land there, the way cattle move in a herd like a single slow thought. She told him about growing up in Wichita, about her mother's botanical field guide, about the particular childhood grief of watching someone you love become diminished by circumstances she did not deserve. She was brilliant, Harriet said. She knew the name of everything that grew. She would have been a scientist if she had been born somewhere that permitted women to be scientists. She was quiet for a moment. She made the best of what she had. I used to think that was noble. Now I think it was a waste, and the waste was not her fault, but it was still a waste. And you decided you would not make the same kind of peace, Paul said. I decided I would fight for better than what was handed to me, she said. Yes. That is why you are here, he said, not a question. That is why I am here, she agreed. They rode in silence for a while, comfortable with it in the way that people only become when they have moved past the stage of needing to fill space with sound. Then Paul said, I want to tell you the thing I said I would tell you after. It is not after yet, she said. The injunction has not been filed. No, he said, but I find I cannot wait any longer, which is unusual for me. I am generally patient. He paused. I have not been patient particularly about this. She kept her eyes on the dark road ahead. Her heart was doing something complicated. Tell me then, she said. I love you, he said, simply, completely, without decoration. The way he said most true things. I have been watching you walk into difficult rooms and solve impossible problems and be kind and honest and formidably competent for 3 months, and I love you in a way that feels entirely permanent. I understand if you do not feel the same. I'm not asking for anything. I simply wanted you to know. The road stretched ahead of them through the dark Kansas night. Somewhere to the east an owl called. The horses moved steadily. Paul, she said. Yes. Do you know what I thought when you first looked up from that newspaper? A pause. What? I thought that is a man who is thinking about something real, she said. Not performing, not managing an impression, just genuinely thinking about something real. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people performing, and I did not realize until that moment how exhausting it had been. She looked at him then in the dark, and whatever expression was on her face made him turn to look at her too, and the horses walked on at their own pace while the two of them looked at each other. I love you too, she said. I have been logical about it, which is my way, but it is no less true for the logic. He reached across the space between the horses and she took his hand, and they rode the rest of the way to where Judge Bain had made his night camp with their hands linked in the cold November dark. Judge Arthur Bain was a tall, spare man of about 60, who had the quality of stillness that comes from decades of weighing consequential things. He was awake when they arrived, sitting by a modest fire with a book open on his knee, and he looked up at them with an expression of alert attention as they dismounted and introduced themselves. He listened to Paul's account of the Webb situation for 30 minutes without interrupting. He read through the documentation with the careful attention of someone who has learned to distinguish genuine evidence from assembled grievance. He asked 6 precise questions. Then he took out a paper from his own saddlebag and began writing. And when he was done, he handed it to Paul and told him that he would ride into Caldwell first thing in the morning, and that no property transaction involving the disputed survey records would be permitted to proceed until his court had reviewed the full record. "Is there anything else I should know before I enter that town?" Bain asked. "A young man named Billy Rourke was shot yesterday," Paul said. "He is a witness and he needs protection." Bain's expression did not change, but something hardened in it, like metal cooling. "I will arrange it," he said. They rode back to Caldwell through the early morning dark, and Harriet felt, for the first time in weeks, something that she cautiously identified as relief. But Caldwell was not done with them yet. They arrived back in town as the first light was breaking, gray and cold and exact, and tied their horses at the rail in front of the Prairie Rose, which was not yet open but whose back door Mrs. Dunmore, who ran the kitchen, sometimes left unlocked for reasons that were not examined too closely. Paul was about to say something when they saw, through the gray dawn, a figure step out of the shadows beside the land office. It was one of Webb's men, a large man named Cutter who Harriet had seen before and had instinctively disliked, the kind of person who does not bother to pretend at decency. "Mr. Covington," Cutter said, "Mr. Webb would like a word." "Mr. Webb can have a word with Judge Bain when he arrives this morning," Paul said. Cutter's hand moved toward his hip. Paul's moved faster, and that was when everything happened at once. A scuffle, voices raised, the sound of boots on frozen ground, and Harriet, operating on something below thought, pulled the Colt from her skirt pocket. Her late husband's gun, which she had carried since Wichita because a woman traveling alone was not a fool about such things. She pointed it at Cutter. Cutter went still. And that was when Marcus Webb himself walked out of the land office door, and Paul, looking at Webb's face and at the piece of paper Webb was holding, understood what had happened. Webb had gotten to the telegraph office in the night. He had sent a message to Wichita. He had somehow obtained a signed order from the compromised judge there, predating Bain's circuit authority, that purported to transfer the Delacourt property to his company effective immediately. And he had found someone to add Paul Covington's signature to an accompanying document that certified the survey records were accurate. A forged signature. Paul's name on a lie. The mechanism of Webb's trap. Cutter stepped back now that Harriet had the gun. Webb stood on his step and held up the paper and said, with the calm of a man who believes he has already won, "Mr. Covington, I took the liberty of processing the Delacourt transaction last night through channels that are entirely within my authority. The signature on this certification is yours. If you contest it, you are contesting your own sworn statement. And Mrs. Thatcher," he added, "has been seen carrying concealed firearms and threatening my employee, which I believe violates." "The signature is forged," Paul said. "Prove it," Webb said. And this was the moment that Harriet had been standing in when the story began. The gun pressed to Paul's temple was not what had actually happened, because she loved him and was not going to shoot him. But the image in her mind in that moment was so vivid that she understood how completely upside down everything had become. She lowered the Colt. She turned to face Marcus Webb on his step in the gray November morning, and she said, very clearly, "I have $47, Mr. Webb. I spent all of them on the Delacourts." But more relevantly, Billy Rourke's written testimony, which describes in specific detail the alterations you asked him to make to survey documents, is currently in the possession of Judge Arthur Bain, who is riding into your town right now and who has already issued a preliminary injunction that supersedes any filing made through your tame judge in Wichita. "Good morning." Webb stared at her. The certainty on his face did something complicated. Behind her she heard hoofbeats. She turned. Judge Bain and two men she did not know were riding down the main street of Caldwell in the early morning light, and behind them, waving from the doorway of the doctor's office, was Billy Rourke with his arm in a sling and his expression one of profound and grateful relief. The week that followed was the most legally chaotic of Harriet's life, and she had once sat through an entire probate hearing involving 7 disputed chairs. Judge Bain moved through Caldwell with the methodical authority of someone who has seen men like Webb before and has developed a particular efficient contempt for them. He reviewed every document. He interviewed every witness. He had Harlan Fitch detained in the hotel as a material witness, which Fitch found deeply offensive and which Harriet found deeply satisfying. He arranged for sheriff's deputies from the county seat to provide protection for the Delacourt family and for Billy Rourke. The forged signature on the survey certification was identified by a document examiner brought in from Kansas City, a quiet woman named Mrs. Chen who looked at it for about 45 seconds and said, with academic certainty, that it had been added by a different hand. This was not the most dramatic moment of the proceedings, but it was the most decisive. Marcus Webb was arrested on a charge of fraud and conspiracy. Harlan Fitch, it turned out, had enough expensive lawyers to avoid criminal charges but could not avoid the civil consequences, and the Wichita judge who had been taking payments was removed from his position. The county record's office in Wichita underwent a review that resulted in 3 clerks losing their positions and 1 gaining a criminal record. The Delacourts kept their farm. On the evening after Webb's arrest, Harriet sat on the steps of the schoolhouse again in the November cold and watched the last light drain from the western sky and felt something settle in her that she recognized as peace. Paul sat down beside her. He had been in meetings with Bain's people all day and he looked tired in a clean, satisfied way, the way you look when you have spent your exhaustion on something worthwhile. They sat in silence for a long moment. "It is after," she said. He turned and looked at her. "You said you would tell me things after," she said. "After the injunction, after all of it, it is after." "I told you on the road," he said. "I know," she said, "and I told you. But I want to say something else now in daylight when neither of us is afraid." She turned to face him fully. The November air was cold and the last of the sunset was amber and precise behind him. "I want to know what happens next. For you, I mean. Now that this is done," he considered. "I was thinking," he said, "about the survey work. There is legitimate demand for honest surveyors in this territory, someone who can produce accurate records who cannot be bought." He paused. "I was also thinking that Caldwell might benefit from a school that continues past primary instruction. There are young people here who want more than arithmetic. The town would need money for that," she said. "The Delacourts," he said, "suggested that if we established a school fund they would be the first contributors." She smiled. "And what else were you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the last light on the western horizon. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "about what you said on the road about permanence." He turned to look at her. "I meant what I said, and I want to ask you something, but I want to ask it correctly. Not because I am afraid of the answer, or not only because of that, but because it seems like the kind of thing that should be asked properly." "Paul," she said. "Yes. Ask it improperly if necessary," she said. "I am not a woman who requires ceremony." Something relaxed in him. "Would you stay," he said, "in Caldwell with me? As my wife, when you are willing, if you are willing, and if not as my wife then in whatever capacity you would accept, because I am not interested in losing you from my life again under any circumstances." She looked at him for a long moment. The last of the sunset went out behind him and the first stars appeared over Kansas, extravagant as always. "Yes," she said, "I will stay." He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture as the road, the same gravity, and they sat on the schoolhouse steps in the November dark while Caldwell settled around them. And it was the most complete Harriet had felt since she could remember. They were married in December, in the church whose roof Marcus Webb had once funded, which everyone found appropriately ironic. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Miles Oates, who had known Paul slightly and Harriet not at all, but who conducted the whole affair with warm efficiency. Mrs. Adkins cried without apology. August Honer shook Paul's hand for approximately 30 seconds with great feeling. The Delacourts came, all of them, including the children who had made Harriet a drawing of a schoolhouse with flowers around it that she kept for years. Billy Rourke was there with his arm still in its sling, and an expression of relief so profound it had transformed his whole face. He had been offered a position with Judge Bain's circuit court as a records assistant, which was exactly the right place for someone who had decided that accuracy and honesty mattered enough to risk something for them. Harriet wore a dark green dress she had made herself from fabric she bought at Honer's General Store. It was not a traditional wedding color, but she had never particularly cared about that, and the green suited her, she thought, better than white ever had. Paul wore a clean white shirt and his best vest and his hat, which she had talked him into having brushed properly for the occasion, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle of the church with an expression so undefended and complete that she had to take a breath to stay composed. He was 31 to her 26, and they were well matched in every way that mattered, which was to say they were both people who told the truth, who worked hard, who had been disappointed enough times to understand the value of genuine warmth, and who had enough sense to recognize love when they found it rather than arguing themselves out of it on grounds of inconvenience. They moved into a house on the eastern edge of town that had been vacant since the spring and that needed work, which they did together over the first months of their marriage with a collaborative efficiency that surprised neither of them. Paul was good with structure. Harriet was good with everything that went inside it. The house became, quite quickly, a home, which is a different thing, and the difference lay in the small accumulated weight of two people who are genuinely glad to be in the same place. Paul built his surveying practice through the winter and spring, taking on contracts from ranchers and settlers throughout the region who needed honest work done. His reputation, aided considerably by the Webb affair and by Judge Bain's evident respect for his integrity, spread faster than he expected. By the following summer he had more work than he could handle alone and had taken on an apprentice, a serious young man of 20 named Felipe Guerrero whose mathematical instincts were exceptional. The school expanded. Harriet fought for and obtained a second room and a second teacher, a young woman from Wichita named Clara Jensen, who had studied at the state normal school and who turned out to be both excellent at her work and excellent company. They developed, over the course of a single autumn, the kind of friendship that is founded on mutual respect and complementary annoyances, the best kind. The children of Caldwell learned things. Harriet taught them to read and cipher and think, and she taught them about the land they were living on, its history and its botany, using her mother's field guide and her mother's method of finding the name and purpose of every growing thing. She took them on walks in spring to identify plants, and in the autumn she organized a display at the school of pressed specimens, and it became one of those community events that people attended because it was genuinely interesting rather than merely obligatory. She thought about her mother often, out there in Kansas, and felt that in some way she was doing the thing her mother had wanted to do, not just surviving but actually inhabiting the full dimension of who she was, using all of it, the intelligence and the competence and the will, in ways that mattered to the people around her. The injustice of what Webb had attempted to do to the Delackerts and to the other families stayed with her. She had seen how quickly legitimate ownership could be challenged, how easily records could be altered, how the machinery of law could be captured by money and turned against the people it was meant to protect. She became, over the following years, an advocate for proper recording of land deeds, working with Judge Bain's circuit court to establish better protocols for land transactions in the territory. It was not dramatic work. It was the kind of patient, accurate, document-level work that prevents disasters rather than resolving them, and she considered it one of the more important things she did. In the spring of 1880, their son was born. They named him Thomas Arthur Covington, Thomas for Harriet's late husband whom she had grieved honestly and remembered kindly, and Arthur for Judge Bain who had ridden into Caldwell in the gray November light and done what was right. He was a solid, attentive baby who regarded the world with the considering expression of someone taking everything under advisement, and both his parents found this quality enormously endearing. Paul, who had grown up without siblings and had not known his own father well, took to fatherhood with the same patient and genuine attention he brought to everything he cared about. He could be found in the evenings walking the baby in the kitchen, while Harriet graded papers at the table, or sitting on the porch with young Thomas in the crook of his arm, pointing out the evening stars with the air of someone who believes it is never too early to learn the names of things. "You know he cannot understand any of that yet," Harriet said one evening, looking up from her work. "He is learning the pattern of the voice," Paul said. "That comes before the words." She looked at him across the kitchen and felt something so full and warm it was almost difficult to contain. "You are going to be one of those fathers who teaches his child the name of every constellation," she said. "Every constellation, every tree, every surveying instrument, and how to differentiate between a genuine deed and a fraudulent one," Paul confirmed. "It is a comprehensive curriculum." "You cannot start the surveying instruments until he can sit up," she said. "That seems reasonable," he said. Young Tom Covington grew up to be curious and capable, and to have his father's eyes and his mother's precision with words, which turned out to be a formidable combination. He was 4 when his sister was born, a girl they named Alina Jane, who arrived in the world already certain of her own opinions, and who did not subsequently change this approach. The family of 4 filled the house on the eastern edge of Caldwell in the particular living, breathing way that families do when everyone in them is actually paying attention to each other. There were suppers at the long table that lasted until the candles burned low because no one wanted to stop the conversation. There were the ordinary difficulties and negotiations of a household containing 2 strong-willed adults and 2 children developing strong wills of their own. There was laughter. There was argument, conducted with the fundamental respect of people who trust each other enough to disagree out loud. There were evenings on the porch in summer, watching Kansas do its enormous thing with the sky, the sunsets that went on forever in colors that seemed too extravagant to be real, and they would sit side by side in the chairs Paul had built, and the children would be inside or nearby, and the day would settle around them, and they would talk or be quiet in turns, equally comfortable with both. In the autumn of 1882, a man came to Caldwell who said he was from the railroad company. He had been sent, he explained, to discuss the possibility of a rail spur that might connect Caldwell more directly to the main Kansas Pacific line. It was, he said, a genuine proposal, and the company was committed to fair dealing with property owners along the proposed route. Paul sat across from him in the land company office, which was now run by an honest man named Garrett whose methods were entirely transparent, and he listened to the proposal with care. Then he said, "I would like to see the full survey of the proposed route before any discussion of terms." The railroad man said that was completely reasonable. The survey was accurate. The proposed route was genuinely beneficial. The compensation offered to the 2 ranching families along the way was fair, and Paul, who had become something of an informal advocate for property owners in the region, negotiated on their behalf to make it slightly more than fair. The spur was built by 1884, and it brought Caldwell into a new era of commerce and connectivity that was good for most of the town's residents. Marcus Webb, meanwhile, had served 2 years in the state penitentiary and had gone east upon his release. No one who knew him in Caldwell expected to see him again. Harlan Fitch had retreated to St. Louis and turned his attention to ventures in other states, which was someone else's problem now. The Delackerts were still farming their land in 1884, and better than before. Old Henry Delackert had expanded his wheat operation, and his son Jean-Pierre, who was now 20, had developed a particular aptitude for the new mechanized farming equipment that was beginning to change how the land was worked. He and Paul's apprentice Felipe Guerrero had become close friends, which Harriet found appropriate in the way that things sometimes fall into the right shape without anyone engineering them. Billy Rourke wrote from Topeka, where he had been promoted within the circuit court system to a supervisory records position. His letters were careful and precise, and occasionally funny in the dry way of someone who has discovered that survival is easier if you maintain a sense of proportion. Harriet wrote back regularly, and kept his letters in the same box as her mother's field guide. One evening in the late autumn of 1884, Paul and Harriet were sitting on the porch in the last of the season's mild weather. The children were inside, Tom doing his lessons with the focused reluctance of a boy who would prefer to be outside, Eleanor conducting some private operation involving several dolls and an elaborate system of small furniture that she had reorganized 4 times since morning. Harriet had her hands in her lap and was watching the road, which was quiet in the late afternoon. Paul had a book open on his knee but was not reading it. "Do you know what I thought," Paul said, "when you sat down across from me in the prairie rose?" She turned to look at him. "You have never told me." "I thought," he said, "that you were the most direct person I had ever seen, and that it was going to be either very inconvenient or very necessary, and I was already hoping it would be necessary before I had finished the thought." She smiled. "Was that when you decided to help me?" "I decided to help you about 4 seconds after you said you would walk to Marcus Webb's office yourself," he said. "That is when I understood that you were either going to change everything or get yourself into serious trouble, and I could not determine which without staying involved." "You were protecting your investment," she said. "I was recognizing something important," he said. He looked at her with the expression that had been hers to know for 6 years now, the one without any wall behind it. "You have never been anything but exactly what you are. There is no hidden version, no secret agenda, no performance. That is the most extraordinary quality I have ever encountered in a person." She felt that in her chest, warm and settled and true. "You are not so different," she said. "No hidden motives, no dark past lurking around corners, just a man who would rather do something right than something easy." "The dark past," he said with a small smile, "is very boring. It involves cattle and an unpleasant cousin." "I know," she said. "I know everything about you, Paul Covington." "You do," he agreed. He reached over and took her hand, the same gesture. 6 years and 2 children and a whole life later, still the same weight and warmth and intention. "And I know everything about you." The road was quiet. Inside the house, Tom Covington had apparently reached the end of his patience with his lessons, because they could hear him attempting to negotiate with Eleanor about whether her dolls could serve as an audience for an impromptu performance of something. And Eleanor was making clear that the dolls had their own schedule and could not simply be conscripted. Paul and Harriet listened to their children argue with the comfortable amusement of parents who know the argument will resolve itself and who are not yet needed. "I want another one," Harriet said. Paul looked at her. "Another child?" "Yes," she considered. "I am 32. It is not too late, and this house has room." She looked back at the road. "I think Tom and Eleanor would rise to the occasion." "Tom would be insufferably competent about it," Paul said. "Eleanor would determine the rules by which the new sibling was required to operate." "Both of those things are true," Harriet agreed. "I still think we should." He squeezed her hand. "I think so too," he said. Their second son arrived in the spring of 1886, and they named him James Henry Covington. James for no particular historical reason except that it suited him immediately, and Henry for August Honer the blacksmith, who had died peacefully the previous winter and who had been, in the quiet way of certain people, essential to the community around him without ever making a production of it. James Henry was a sunny, enthusiastic child who treated every new thing as a personal gift, and who had Harriet's dark eyes and Paul's ease with physical space, moving through the world with an uncomplicated confidence that made his parents laugh with the particular pleasure of watching a person be exactly who they are. The school continued. Harriet taught for 20 more years and trained 2 generations of teachers who went on to schools throughout Kansas and beyond. She wrote a curriculum guide that was adopted by several territories, a practical document about how to teach children in frontier communities using the materials available, which was not the botanical field guide her mother might have written but was, in its own way, a record of what she knew and how she had used it. Paul's surveying practice became, eventually, a proper firm with 3 employees, and a reputation that extended far beyond Caldwell. He testified twice before state legislative committees about land recording practices, and both times said what he thought without modification, which was noted by the legislators who understood what that meant and irritated the ones who preferred their witnesses more flexible. In the evenings he was home. That was the thing Harriet valued most, not any public achievement or recognized success, but the fact that when the day ended Paul Covington came home and sat down at the same table with his wife and his children, and was genuinely, completely present, not performing fatherhood or performing marriage, but actually inhabiting it, curious and engaged and warm. They grew older together in the way that good things age, not diminishing but deepening, finding new detail in what had always been there. He developed gray at his temples, and she developed laugh lines around her eyes, and both of them considered these developments unremarkable, except when they noticed each other had them, and felt something soft and grateful in the noticing. Tom Covington grew up and went to the State University in Lawrence to study engineering, which surprised no one who had watched him take apart and reassemble every mechanical object in the house between the ages of 8 and 14. Eleanor followed 2 years later to study law, which also surprised no one, least of all her parents. James Henry stayed in Caldwell and took over the surveying firm when Paul was ready to step back, which Paul was not entirely ready to do, but which he managed because James Henry was excellent at the work, and because Paul had enough self-knowledge to recognize when holding on had stopped being principled and started being just holding on. In the spring of 1900, which was the year Harriet turned 48 and Paul turned 53, they made a trip to Wichita that they had been planning for 2 years and somehow never executed. It was not a significant journey, an overnight trip on the now comfortable rail connection that had once been the ambitious spur, but it felt significant in the way that returning to origin points always does. Wichita was larger than either of them remembered, the frontier city of their youth having become something more settled and urban, its edges smoothed, its ambitions directed toward the 20th century. They walked through streets that Harriet had walked as a young woman, past the building that had once housed the law office where Thomas had worked, past the church school where she had first taught, past the newspaper office where the advertisement had appeared that had sent her west with 2 trunks and $47. That advertisement, she said, standing on the sidewalk outside the newspaper office. It was third from the bottom on the left column. I read it 4 times before I decided. What were the other 3 readings for? Paul asked. The first was to understand it, she said. The second was to find the reasons why it was a bad idea. The third was to evaluate whether the reasons were actually good reasons or just fear wearing the costume of reason. The fourth was to decide. He looked at her with the expression she had first seen 30 seconds into their acquaintance and had been watching ever since. What was the deciding factor? The salary, she said. $22 a month was genuinely better than anything available in Wichita at the time. That is extremely practical. I am extremely practical. You are, he said. And then, I am very glad you are. They walked back to their hotel through the Wichita evening, through streets that smelled of the new century, the particular mixture of old prairie and new ambition, and Harriet thought about the woman who had read the advertisement in this same city 22 years ago, alone and practical and hoping for better than she had been given, and felt toward that woman the particular tenderness you feel toward someone who turned out to be all right. She had been right to want more. She had been right to go. She had been right to sit down across from a man in a saloon and ask him for help because something in his face suggested he had a conscience. And she had been right to love him when it became clear that he was exactly who he appeared to be. No hidden motives, no betrayal waiting around a corner, no trap, just a man of genuine and uncomplicated goodness who wanted the same things she did and was willing to work for them. They came home to Caldwell on the Tuesday train, and Tom met them at the station, home for a visit from the engineering firm in Topeka, where he had been a partner for 4 years. He was 30 now, his father's height and his mother's precision, and he was in the process of being very careful about not mentioning the young woman in Topeka whose name appeared in his letters with increasing frequency, which Harriet had noticed and was allowing him to disclose at his own pace. Alina wrote from Kansas City, where she had a law practice and a reputation for taking cases involving land rights and property disputes, which she had decided to specialize in after a long conversation with her mother about the Webb affair. Her letters were articulate and fierce, and frequently very funny. James Henry had recently told them that his wife Clara, who was the daughter of Clara Jensen, the teacher Harriet had hired all those years ago, was expecting their first child in the autumn, which would make Paul and Harriet grandparents, which they received with the calm pleasure of people who had been paying attention and knew that this was the right next thing. The house on the eastern edge of Caldwell was quieter now than it had been with 3 children in it, but it was not empty. It had the full quality of a place that has been deeply inhabited, where the walls have absorbed something of the life that has happened in them, where the kitchen table knows the weight of 20 years of conversation, where the porch chairs hold the impression of 2 people who sat in them on summer evenings and watched Kansas be beautiful and enormous and entirely itself. On an October evening in 1900, Paul and Harriet sat on that porch in the last of the season's warmth. The prairie stretched out ahead of them, golden and quiet, the late light on the grass making it look lit from within. The town behind them made its ordinary sounds, a wagon on the road, a dog's distant commentary, the 6 o'clock train whistle from the station that Harriet had heard so many times she could no longer imagine the day without it. "Tell me something," Paul said. "What kind of something?" "Anything," he said. "Something you have not told me before. I find it hard to believe there is such a thing after 22 years, but I remain optimistic." She considered. "When I was 14, she said, I wrote to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington asking whether they accepted botanical specimens from Kansas. I had been pressing and documenting plants all summer, and I thought I had found something unusual in the creek bed behind our house. Did they respond?" "They did," she said. 3 months later, they were very courteous. They said the specimen I described was a known variety and not unusual, but they commended my observation and documentation methods and suggested I keep at it. "You have never told me that," he said. "No," she agreed. "Your mother would have loved that story," he said. She felt the warmth of that, the way he knew which things would reach her after all this time, still that precise. She would have, she said. They were quiet for a while. The October light changed, going from gold to amber, the shadows lengthening across the grass. "I want to tell you something," Paul said. "Tell me." "I have never once in 22 years regretted sitting in that saloon," he said. "Not one morning, not one difficult day, not one moment of the entire enterprise." She looked at him in the amber light. He was 53 years old, and the gray at his temples had become something more general, and the lines in his face were deep and particular, and she had memorized all of them, every one, with the same attention she had once brought to her mother's field guide. "Neither have I," she said. He took her hand. The same gesture, the same weight, more than 2 decades of the same choice renewed in the same motion. The sun went down over Kansas in a long exhalation of color, orange and rose, and finally the deep blue of evening, and the first stars appeared, extravagant as always, and Harriet Thatcher Covington sat on her porch in the life she had chosen, holding the hand of the man she had loved from the moment she understood what loving someone without any hidden reservation actually felt like, and she was entirely, completely, at peace. James Henry's son was born that November. They named him Paul James Covington, which made the elder Paul say nothing at all for a full 30 seconds, and then clear his throat in a way that Harriet recognized as his version of being moved beyond the capacity of words. She found this endlessly endearing. She found most things about him endearing after 22 years, the way he cleared his throat instead of crying, the way he said true things simply, The way he still came home at the end of every day with the same quality of genuine arrival, as if coming home to her was the real destination of everything else he did. It was, she thought, and she was his. The Kansas stars did their extravagant thing overhead, just as they had that night on the road when they had ridden through the dark with the documents that would protect a family's home, and everything that had followed from that night. From the choice to sit down across from a man in a saloon, from the choice to tell the truth and do the right thing and believe that these choices accumulate into something worth living. And they had accumulated into exactly this. Into a life that was wide open and fully inhabited and entirely, permanently their own.